Welcome to Aircraft, your gateway to thrilling HFY sci-fi stories where humanity stands strong among the stars. Here, you'll experience epic encounters with alien civilizations, moments of human courage, intelligence, and the unstoppable spirit that makes humanity unique. Every story on this channel is narrated by a real human voice, not AI, bringing you a more authentic and immersive storytelling experience. If you love sci-fi adventures and stories where humanity proves its worth in the universe, you're in the right place. Let's start the story.
There is a moment in every courtroom across every civilization that has ever built one where the air changes, where the weight of what is about to happen settles into the room like something solid. Every species that has developed law has also developed that moment. The Kethari call it Vrelona, the hell breath before the stone falls. The Sorvani have 17 words for it, each one more precise than the last. Humans don't have a word for it. They have something better. They have a girl named Mura Okafor who looked up at 7 judges of the Galactic High Council, heard her death sentence read aloud in 4 languages, and said, "Yeah, that's not going to work for me. Let me tell you what I saw. My name is Seth Kivan, and was senior diplomatic attaché to the Kethari consulate on Meridian Station. I have attended 41 High Council proceedings. I have witnessed the sentencing of warlords, the dissolution of star systems, the quiet bureaucratic deaths of entire species' political standing. I am not, by any measure, a being easily moved. I am writing this account because what happened in Chamber 7 on the 43rd day of the Meridian Conclave is not accurately reflected in the official record. The official record states that the human defendant disrupted proceedings and fled into council custody. That is the kind of sentence that gets written by people who need the truth to be smaller than it was. I will tell you what actually happened. But to understand that, you need to understand Mara Okafor, not the version of her the council built in their indictment. The rogue xenobiologist, the treaty saboteur, the human whose unauthorized contact with the Veil and Eye convergence supposedly destabilized 3-star systems worth of carefully negotiated silence. That version of her exists in 17 documents, and none of them got her right. The version I need you to understand is the one I first saw 11 days before the trial. She was sitting in the detention corridor of Meridian Station's 3rd sublevel, cross-legged on the floor outside her cell. Not inside it, outside it, which should have been impossible, eating something she'd apparently convinced a Sorvani maintenance worker to smuggle in. It was some kind of dense, dark food that smelled aggressively organic in the recycled air of the station. Later I would learn it was called chocolate. She was reading a physical book, paper pages, actual ink, a technology so archaic in this part of the galaxy that 3 of the station's security staff had initially logged it as an unidentified device. She looked up when I passed. Not with the wariness of someone facing execution. Not with the performance of someone who knew they were being watched. She just looked up the way a person looks up from a book when they hear footsteps, alert, briefly, and then back down. I stopped. I don't fully know why I stopped. Perhaps it was professional instinct. Perhaps it was the book. Perhaps it was the fact that she was sitting outside a locked cell that she had clearly exited at some point and apparently decided to remain near out of. I had no category for it. Courtesy? Respect for the concept of confinement, even when the execution of confinement had failed. "You're the Kethari attaché," she said, without looking up. "I am." My translation implant rendered my speech into standard. Hers came back clean. She spoke it natively, which was common for humans who worked in galactic-facing roles. "You know me? I've been in this corridor for 9 days. You walk past twice a day, same time, same direction. You're the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm already dead." She turned a page. "So either you're here to help me, or you're just polite. Either way, you're interesting." I stood there for a moment. In Kethari social architecture, this was an invitation to sit. I was not certain if it was the same in hers. She glanced up again. "You can sit, you know. The floor's not great, but it's survivable. For a Death World species, at least." The corner of her mouth did something. A small asymmetric movement that I would later understand was humor in its quieter register. "You're not Death World, so you might want something to stand on." I crouched. It was not comfortable for my frame, but I managed. "You've been charged with convergence interference," I said. Not the most diplomatic opening. I was already off my practice script in ways I could not explain. I know what I've been charged with. She closed the book on her finger, keeping her place. Her eyes were very direct, a feature of human faces I found difficult to categorize. Most species signal attention with peripheral cues. Humans aim their entire face at you like a targeting instrument. Do you want to know if I did it? Did you? She considered this with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. Not the performance of innocence. Not calculation. Something slower and more honest than either. I made contact with the veil and I, she said. Without counsel authorization. That part's accurate. But interfering with the convergence implies I had that kind of influence over them, and I really didn't. She opened the book again. They made their own choices. I just didn't run away when they started talking to me. I thought about this for the rest of my walk. Then I turned around, walked back, and crouched down again. What were they saying? I asked. When they talked to you. Mara Okafor looked up from her book, and this time the expression on her face was not the small humor I'd seen before. It was something more careful, more weighted. The face of someone deciding how much of a true thing to say to a stranger. They were asking, she said, if anyone would come looking for them if they disappeared. I did not have a response to that. I don't think one exists. She went back to her book. I stayed crouched on that floor for another 4 minutes by my internal clock, which was not a very dignified performance for a senior diplomatic attaché of the Cathari consulate. But I found that I could not immediately stand up. The Veil and I convergence had been silent for 6 years. Official council position was that the convergence had entered a voluntary isolation period, a common enough occurrence with species at their developmental stage. 6 years of silence, no contact attempts, no distress signals, no violation of the quarantine boundaries the council had helpfully drawn around their space. Mara Okafor had crossed those boundaries with a single research vessel and a crew of 4. She had made contact. She had listened. And now she was sitting outside a cell on Meridian Station's 3rd sublevel, eating chocolate and reading a paper book, waiting to be executed for what she'd heard. The trial was scheduled to begin in 11 days. I attended as an observer, which is a Cathari diplomatic role that means nothing officially and grants me access to everything in practice. I had a seat in the 3rd gallery, behind the Sorvani block, and to the left of the human diplomatic mission, a small, tightly grouped cluster of humans who had traveled from their home systems to watch one of their own be judged. They were dressed formally, which for humans meant dark colors and carefully managed expression. They looked like people who had already processed their grief and were now operating on something harder. The chamber was built on the classical Cathari model, which the council had adopted some 900 cycles ago as the default for high proceedings. A circular space, the bench elevated on 7 tiers so that the judges looked down at the defendant from a height that was architecturally intended to communicate the distance between power and its subjects. The acoustics were designed so that the judges' voices reached every corner of the room with perfect clarity, while voices from the floor required a formal amplification request. The architecture, in other words, had a philosophy. And the philosophy was, you are small, and we are above you, and this is the natural order. Mara Okafor walked in wearing the standard detention gray of a council holding facility. Her wrists were bound with a soft field restraint, invisible but present, monitoring her movement radius. She was shorter than I'd remembered from the corridor. Humans are not a tall species. They are compact and dense in a way that doesn't read as formidable until you see one move. She moved like someone who had decided to be comfortable. That was the first thing. The guards on either side of her moved with the clipped efficiency of security professionals performing their function. She moved the way she'd been sitting in that corridor, like the space she was occupying was hers, not borrowed. Not defiant, not performed, just present. She looked up at the 7 judges on her 7 tiers, and the expression on her face was thoughtful. Interested even, like she was reading an interesting page. Chief Arbiter Vorshan Delkai of the Cathari High Seat, a being of considerable reputation and considerably more ego, looked down at her from the topmost tier and began the formal opening of proceedings. I had heard Delkai open proceedings before. He had a voice calibrated for moral weight, the kind of voice that expects to settle into chambers and stay. Every syllable arriving like a piece of furniture being placed. He spoke for 7 minutes. The charges, the evidence, the council's position on the Veil and I situation, and the unauthorized breach of sanctioned quarantine. He built a structure of language around Mara Okafor, designed to make her small, smaller than the charges, smaller than the room, smaller than the 7 tiers looking down at her. She listened with her hands clasped in front of her, the soft field restraint a faint shimmer at her wrists. She listened the way she'd listened in the corridor, fully, without performance, like someone storing information. When Delkai finished, the chamber was given over to the evidentiary period. I will not summarize the next 4 hours in detail. What matters is the shape of it. A systematic construction of culpability, each piece placed with judicial precision. The human diplomatic observer permitted to speak twice in formal rebuttal and twice dismissed with the courteous authority of a body that has already decided, but must perform the process of deciding. What I noticed across those 4 hours was that Mara Okafor never looked frightened. Not once. She looked at various points, attentive, skeptical, quietly amused by something no one else in the room appeared to find funny, and once, during testimony from a counsel xenodiplomacy specialist regarding the Valenie's supposed fragile developmental stage, visibly, restrainedly, profoundly irritated. That irritation was the first crack in her composure, and it was so brief that I think I was one of perhaps 3 beings in the chamber who noticed it. It was there, and then it was managed smoothed back into attention. But I had seen it, and it told me something. She was not calm because she had detached from the situation. She was calm because she had already run the situation through whatever internal process humans run things through, and she had arrived somewhere. I did not know where. I would learn in about 40 minutes. The evidentiary period concluded. Chief Arbiter Delkai called for the chamber's formal consideration, a 3-minute recess that was, practically speaking, a formality. The council had filed its recommendation. The arbiters had reviewed the evidence. The vote had already happened in 3 pretrial sessions, closed to observers. When Delkai returned to the bench, the chamber quieted in that specific way chambers quiet, not from silence spreading, but from sound withdrawing, pulling back from some center. Delkai looked down at Mara Okafor from the highest tier. He read the verdict. He read the sentence. And Mara Okafor, hands clasped in front of her, soft field restraint shimmering at her wrists, looked up at him and said, in a voice that was not loud but reached every corner of the room because she knew the acoustics and had calculated exactly how much breath to put behind the words, "I'd like to enter new evidence." The chamber did not go silent. It went something beyond silent. It went into that state of collective suspension that happens when a room full of thinking beings all encounter the same impossible thing at the same moment, and their minds are all trying to process it simultaneously while none of them want to be the first to produce a response. Delkai's face, Cathari, scaled, trained in judicial neutrality for 60 years, did something it should not have been able to do. It expressed surprise. The evidentiary period, he said, with the care of someone handling something fragile, has concluded. I know, Mara Okafor said, but I couldn't enter this evidence during the evidentiary period because the council's classification protocols would have triggered an immediate suppression order, and you would never have heard it. The only moment it can be entered into a high proceeding record, under Galactic Charter Article 7, subsection 12, is post-verdict, before execution of sentence. The silence returned. It was a different silence now. I recognized this one. This was the silence of 7 judges recalling, simultaneously, that Article 7, subsection 12 existed. A subsection that almost no one ever invoked, because almost no one ever had anything to invoke it with. You have, Delkai said slowly, the right to present such evidence. The words came out like he was checking each one for weight before setting it down. However, if the court determines that said evidence was obtainable through legitimate means prior to the conclusion of the evidentiary period, the submission will be struck, and the court may apply additional. It wasn't obtainable through legitimate means, she said, because the council classified it 6 years ago when the Vale and I first went silent. She looked up at him with the same direct gaze she'd leveled at me in the corridor. And I think you know what I found when I crossed those quarantine boundaries. Vorshan Delkai, Chief Arbiter of the Cathari High Seat, senior jurist of the Galactic Council for 31 years, had a particular stillness come over him. Mara Okafor reached into the front of her detention uniform, a movement that made both guards tense, and produced a data chip. Small, standard format. She held it up between 2 fingers. The Vale and I aren't in voluntary isolation, she said. They're dying. Something inside their convergent space is killing them, slowly enough that standard monitoring didn't catch it, but fast enough that in another 4 years there won't be a Vale and I convergence to quarantine. They asked me if anyone would come looking for them. I told them yes. Then, the council arrested me before I could make that true. She looked around the chamber, at the galleries, at the human block who had gone very still, at me, briefly, before her gaze returned to the highest tier. This chip has their biometric record, their distress documentation, and their formal request for council intervention. Logged by me, witnessed by my crew, encoded in a format that can't be altered. She set it on the defense table in front of her. I'd like it entered into the record. 7 judges on 7 tiers. A room full of beings from 40 species. The data chip sat on the table. Mara Okafor clasped her hands in front of her again and waited. And Delkai did something then that I have never, in 41 proceedings, seen a sitting arbiter do. He looked away from the defendant. Just for a moment. Just enough. But in 31 years of proceedings, I had learned to read that gesture. And what it read was, he knew. He had known. The classification 6 years ago hadn't been administrative. It had been deliberate. The Vale and I had been asking for help for 6 years, and someone in this council had made sure no one went looking. Mara Okafor had crossed a quarantine boundary, heard a dying species ask if anyone cared, and said yes. She was the only one who'd said yes. She stood in that chamber, 5 feet 4 inches of compact human, detention gray, wrists soft field restrained, data chip on the table in front of her, and the thing on her face was not triumph, not fear, not the performance of courage. She just looked like someone who had decided what mattered and was not going to undecided. The chamber erupted. I don't mean that metaphorically. 7 species worth of diplomatic observers, judicial staff, press corps, and council security all began producing sound and motion at the same moment, and the acoustics of a chamber designed for controlled proceedings turned all of it into a wall. I saw the human block on their feet. I saw 3 of the 7 judges conferring in urgent subvocalization, their implants creating a private channel that I could see by the faint resonance shimmer at their temples, but not here. I saw Chief Arbiter Delkai's hand come up in the formal signal for chamber order, and I saw one of the security staff begin moving toward the defense table, toward the data chip. I saw Mara Okafor see it too. What happened next took 4 seconds. I have played it back in my memory many times, trying to find different interpretations, and I keep arriving at the same one. She was faster than anyone in that room expected a human to be. Not combat fast, not the speed of violence. The speed of someone who had anticipated this exact moment, had decided what they would do when it came, and executed that decision before the room finished processing that the moment had arrived. She picked up the data chip. She threw it, not at the security officer. Not at the judges. She threw it into the gallery, high, in a long arc directly toward the human diplomatic block. A clean throw, the kind that comes from practice, and it landed in the hands of the human mission recorder who had been, I realized, standing with her hands slightly raised and her eyes tracking the arc since the moment Mara's hand moved. Mission recorder Yemi Adeyemi caught it without looking away from Chief Arbiter Delkai. And in her other hand, raised now, visible to every camera in the chamber, was a broadcast transmitter already active, already connected to the open press network that reached every station in the sector. The chip's data was transmitting. Had been transmitting, I realized, from the moment Adeyemi's hand closed around it. Possibly from the moment it was in the air. Possibly before that. Mara Okafor stood at the defense table with both hands raised and the ghost of that small, asymmetric smile on her face. Evidence entered, she said. The chamber did not erupt again. It went the other kind of chaos, the frozen kind, where every being in the room is processing too many things at once to produce motion. Chief Arbiter Delkai stood on his tier. He was looking at Mara Okafor. She was looking at him, and the galaxy was watching. I need to explain what it means to strike a sitting arbiter. Not physically, not in the crude sense that the council's official summary would later use to describe what happened. Assault on judicial authority. A phrase so legally precise it became meaningless as soon as it was applied to Mara Okafor. In their language, in their documentation, struck means violence. One body against another. The thing you do when all other options have failed and you have decided that failure is unacceptable. What Mara Okafor did to Vorshan Delkai in Chamber 7 of the Meridian Conclave was not violence. It was worse. She made him visible. The broadcast ran for 11 minutes before Council security successfully jammed the transmission. 11 minutes of biometric data, survival projections, and formal distress documentation from the Vale and I convergence. A dying species asking, in the precise language of Galactic Treaty Protocol, for someone to please notice. 11 minutes of data that had been classified for 6 years by a council filing that listed its authorization as administrative continuity, a category that requires, under charter law, the signature of a sitting arbiter. Foshan Delkai signature. 11 minutes was enough. I know this because I was watching the station's public news feed on my secondary implant while the chamber dissolved around me into something that looked, from the inside, like institutional panic wearing the costume of authority. By the time security jammed the transmission, the data had already been replicated and redistributed by 63 independent press outlets operating from 11 different station sectors. The thing about information in the modern galactic network is that it does not travel in a single line that can be cut. It travels in every direction at once. And you can stop the source, but you cannot unring the bell. The bell was ringing. Mara Okafor stood at the defense table with her wrists still restrained and watched it ring. I watch her watch it. This is the part one I want to describe carefully, because I think it is the part that matters most, and the part most likely to be wrong in every account written by beings who are not in that gallery. There's a version of Mara Okafor that history will want to build. The heroic version, the defiant version, the woman who faced down the Galactic High Council and won. That version is not wrong, exactly. But it is incomplete in the specific way that all heroic versions are incomplete. It removes the cost. She looked tired. That's what I saw when the chamber was in chaos, and no one was watching her face because everyone was watching the screens and the judges and the security team moving toward Mission Recorder Adeyemi in the gallery. Mara Okafor stood at the defense table, hands raised, soft field restraint still shimmering at her wrists, and she looked the way a person looks when they have been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and the thing is finally on its way to the ground. Not relief, not triumph, tired, like she had known from the moment she crossed those quarantine boundaries into Vale and I space that this was how it was going to have to go. Like she had mapped the route from that moment to this one and found only one path through, and that path went directly through Chamber 7 and the 7 judges and the death sentence, and she had walked it anyway. I thought about what she'd said in the corridor. They were asking if anyone would come looking for them if they disappeared. And I thought, she didn't promise them she would get away with it. She just promised she would come. The security team reached the defense table. Delkai had given the order. I saw his hand move in the formal signal for restraint and removal. 2 officers flanked Mara on either side, and she let them, which was notable because from what I knew of human physical capability, she did not strictly have to. She lowered her arms. She let them take her. She walked between them toward the chamber's secondary exit with the same unhurried quality she'd had walking in. At the exit, she paused. The guards on either side of her paused with her, which suggested she had stopped moving in a way that made stopping feel like the obvious choice rather than a problem. She looked back at the chamber, at the 7 tiers, and the 6 judges who were still there. Delkai had stepped back from his bench, I realized. He was gone from his tier, which was a thing that had never happened in my experience of high proceedings, a sitting chief arbiter stepping back mid-session. She looked at the place where he had been. Then she looked up at the gallery, at the human block, at Mission Recorder Adeyemi, who was now surrounded by council observers demanding the return of the data chip, and dealing with this demand the way you deal with something that has already happened, patiently with documentation. Mara Okafor looked at Yemi Adeyemi, and Adeyemi looked back at her. Something passed between them that I could not read. Humans do this. They have an entire language below their language, made of expression and angle and the specific quality of a hell gaze, and you can see it operating without being able to translate it. What I could read was its weight. They looked at each other for 3 seconds, and it was 3 seconds of 2 people who had planned something difficult together and were on the other side of it and were checking whether the other one was still there. Adeyemi gave a small nod. Mara's mouth did that asymmetric thing. She turned back toward the exit and walked. The next 4 hours were, from a diplomatic perspective, extraordinary in the specific way that disasters are extraordinary. They reveal, with terrible clarity, everything that was already broken. I spent those 4 hours in the Kethari consulate's secondary briefing room, which shares a ventilation system with the council's administrative level and has accordingly excellent acoustics for hearing things not intended to be heard. What I heard was an institution in the process of discovering that its foundation had a crack in it that had been there for 6 years, load-bearing and ignored. The council's official position had been that the Valenized silence was voluntary, self-imposed isolation, a known pattern for convergent stage species. They had the documentation. They had the monitoring reports. They had the administrative filings. They had Delkai's signature. The problem, the specific, insurmountable problem, was that they also now had 11 minutes of Valen I biometric data on 63 independent press outlets, and that data contained timestamps. And those timestamps revealed that the Valen I's formal distress request had been logged in the Council's own intake system 6 years ago, for months before Delkai signed the administrative continuity classification. Not after, before. The request had arrived. It had been received. It had been classified. A dying species had asked for help, and someone in the most powerful governing body in this region of the galaxy had signed a document making sure no one would know to go look. I do not know Delkai's reasoning. I will not construct it here because I genuinely do not know it, and because I have found that the most dangerous thing one can do with institutional corruption is to explain it in ways that make it comprehensible. Make it comprehensible, and you make it forgivable. Make it forgivable, and you build the next version of it on exactly the same foundation. What I know is that Mara Okafor crossed a quarantine boundary for a reason that was not in any of the Council's 17 documents about her. She crossed it because she'd been studying convergent stage species for 11 years, and something about the silence bothered her. The Council's monitoring said everything was fine. Her data said, this specific type of silence is not what fine looks like. She was right. She was always going to be right because she was the kind of person who sat outside a lock cell. She could have left eating chocolate and reading a paper book because she had decided that being in the cell was the right thing to do until she had a better option. That's the kind of precision of judgment that tends to be correct about the important things. The Council's emergency session lasted 3 hours. I was not in it. What emerged from it arrived in the form of a formal statement to the press pool. Standard crisis communication, carefully structured, designed to acknowledge the minimum possible while positioning the Council as the entity leading the response to the crisis rather than the entity that had created it. It contained no mention of Delkai. It contained a formal acknowledgement that new information regarding the Valen I situation had come to light, and that a full review was being initiated. It contained a sentence, buried in the 4th paragraph, that the sentencing in the matter of Mara Okafor was being held in abeyance, pending the outcome of that review. Abeyance is a legal term. It means the thing is paused. It means the Council was not dropping the charges. Not yet, not officially, but it was not executing anyone this week. Not this week. I read that 4th paragraph 3 times in my briefing room while the ventilation system carried voices from the administrative level that I will not record here because they were not intended for me, and some of them were human voices that I think deserve the privacy of their anger. Then, I want to find Mara Okafor. They'd moved her from the 3rd sublevel to a different holding facility, the diplomatic detention wing, which was technically an upgrade in that the cell doors were better quality and the lighting was not fluorescent. She was inside this cell, which seemed like a deliberate choice on her part, sitting on the bunk with her knees up and the paper book open across them. Attaché Seth Kivon, she said without looking up. Okafor. Did the statement go out? From minutes ago. She turned a page. And abeyance. 4th paragraph. She was quiet for a moment. The book lay open across her knees, and she was not reading it. Her eyes were still but pointed somewhere beyond the page, some interior calculation finishing its run. They're not going to drop it cleanly, she said. They'll review. Wait for the news cycle to move. Try to structure a settlement that makes it look like they're doing the right thing. She closed the book. That's fine. The Valen I data is out. That's the part that can't be undone. You planned all of this, I said. It was not a question. She looked at me. That direct, instrument-aimed gaze. I planned for the parts one could control, she said. Yemi's positioning in the gallery. The chip's broadcast activation. The Article 7 window. A brief pause. A plan for the possibility that Delkai would try to suppress the chip before it left the chamber. You didn't plan for the transmission being jammed. I planned for the transmission being jammed, she said. The 63-outlet distribution was automatic once Yemi's transmitter activated. You don't send something important down one channel. I stayed in the doorway of the diplomatic detention wing. They hadn't barred me from the corridor, which I took as either oversight or a signal that the council was too busy to enforce minor access restrictions, and I looked at Mara Okafor and thought about a species that had evolved as persistence predators, that walked prey to exhaustion across an entire continent, that had built its dominance on the specific capacity to decide that giving up was not an option, and then continue moving long after every other organism would have stopped. The book she was reading was, I noticed, not the same book she'd been reading in the sublevel corridor. This one was thicker. The cover showed a star field and text in what I would later identify as Yoruba. How long did you know? I asked. About the Veil and I? The question landed in the room, and she let it sit for a moment before answering. 11 years of convergence research, she said. There are patterns. When a species goes into voluntary isolation, it looks a certain way. Communication tapers. There's usually a formal notification through secondary diplomatic channels. Monitoring data shows internal consolidation. She looked at the book cover. When something is wrong, it looks different. The absence is wrong in a specific way, like the difference between a person choosing to be quiet and a person who's been told to stop talking. She set the book aside. The Veil and I went quiet the wrong way. I wrote it up. The council reviewed it. They said the monitoring data was within normal parameters. She looked at me again. The monitoring data was within the parameters of the classification window. Delkai's people had adjusted the baseline. The adjusted baseline. Of course. You don't suppress information by destroying it. That leaves evidence. You suppress it by redefining normal until the data fits. Why? I asked. The question felt inadequate for what I was asking. Why would Delkai, Veil and I space, she said, sits at the junction of 3 major hyperlight corridors? If the convergence collapses, if the species goes extinct or fractured, that space goes neutral. Available. She looked at her hands, resting open on her knees, the ghost of the soft field restraint gone now, that she was in diplomatic detention rather than high-security holding. The Veil and I were in the way of something. I don't know exactly what yet, but 6 years ago, someone decided that a species in the way was less inconvenient as a silent problem than as an active negotiating party. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Meridian Station breathed around us. The deep systemic hum of a station this size, 17,000 beings in their various corridors, and chambers and bunk rooms and briefing suites, all of them going about the ordinary mechanics of being alive, while somewhere in a classified intake file a species had been slowly dying. Your crew, I said. The 4 who came with you. Are they free? She said. Diplomatic custody. The council can't hold them without triggering a whole separate set of charter violations, and they know it. Something moved behind her eyes. They're okay. Relief. The word came to me, and then the translation, Thelvas, the Kethari concept of rational grief at a correct loss. The thing you feel when what was lost was worth losing. Except Mara Okafor wasn't experiencing Thelvas. She was experiencing something else. Something closer to the specific relief of someone who had put everything they had on a single decision and found that the decision had held. What happens now? I asked. She picked up the book again. Now, she said, the council has to do one of 3 things. Proceed with the execution and destroy themselves in the press. Formally drop the charges and answer questions about Delkai's classification order. Or initiate a Veil and I intervention and let the legal situation become complicated enough that my case gets buried in it. Which do you think they'll choose? The corner of her mouth moved. 3rd option, she said. They'll frame it as a humanitarian emergency that supersedes the legal question. Very noble. Very counsel. And I'll have a choice between fighting the legal case through a system that's now very motivated to make it go away quietly or letting it go and focusing on actually getting help to the Veil and I. She opened the book to her marked page. I've known what that choice will be since I crossed the boundary. You let it go, I said. The Veil and I have maybe 4 years, she said. I don't. She started reading. I stood in the doorway for another moment. Then I did something I had not done in 41 proceedings. I didn't leave. I sat down on the floor of the diplomatic detention corridor, cross-legged, my frame not designed for it, but managing, and I stayed. Mara Okafor read her book. She didn't comment on my staying. She just turned pages. The station hummed. Somewhere in the administrative levels above us, the Galactic High Council was building its next carefully structured reality around the wreckage of this one. After a while, she held the book out toward me. It's about a woman who discovers her government has been lying to her for her whole life, she said, and what she does about it. Does she win? I asked. Define win, she said. I thought about it. I thought about the veil and eye convergence, 4 years from silence becoming extinction. I thought about 11 minutes of data on 63 press outlets. I thought about a data chip thrown in an arc across a courtroom and caught by someone who was ready. She makes it impossible for them to keep lying, I said. Mara Okafor looked at me for a long moment. Yeah, she said. She wins. Vorshan Delkai resigned his seat on the Galactic High Council 17 days after the trial. The official statement was health-related. The unofficial conversation, the one I heard through the Kethari consulate's secondary briefing room ventilation system, the one between 2 council administrators at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, was considerably more specific. It involved a choice between a quiet exit and a very loud investigation. It involved the discovery of additional classified files, the veil and eye intake request being the most prominent, but not, apparently, the only one. It involved the word accountability being used the way people use it when they mean something closer to before this gets worse. He was gone in 17 days. Mara Okafor had been in diplomatic detention for all 17 of them. I visited every other day. Not officially. Nothing in my diplomatic role required it. And the Kethari consulate's position on the Okafor matter was the careful neutrality of an institution watching which way the current moved before committing to a direction. But I went. I brought, twice, food from a station's market sector that a very patient Servani vendor helped me select based on criteria I'd developed from watching what Mara seemed to eat when given options. She received these contributions without comment except, once, a quiet thank you that landed with more weight than the words carried. We talked, not always about the veil and eye situation, though we talked about that too. We talked about convergence biology and what the biometric data suggested about the pace and nature of whatever was killing the species. We talked about how the council intervention would need to be structured to actually work rather than to appear to work, which are different things that the council historically confused. We talked about her crew, engineer Yusuf Ferreira and the 3 researchers, all of them in voluntary diplomatic holding, all of them apparently in robust health, and, according to mission recorder Adeyemi, deeply annoying to the council administrators assigned to monitor them. We talked about her book. We talked about the Kethari concept of Thelvas and why humans didn't have an equivalent. She thought about this for a long time and then said, "We have lots of words for wrong losses. We have hundreds of words for grief. I think we just don't have a category for correct loss because we don't accept that a loss can be correct. We always think there was something else we could have done." I had no response to this. I thought about it for the rest of the day. On the 18th day, the council dropped the charges. Not cleanly. They never did anything cleanly. It came in the form of a judicial review determination that found procedural irregularities in the original indictment, specifically related to the classification of evidence material to the defense that had not been made available during the evidentiary period. The determination did not mention Delkai by name. It did not acknowledge what the classification had concealed. It was a document that said, in the precise language of institutional self-preservation, "We are releasing this person, and we would prefer that the conversation end here." The conversation did not end there. Adeyemi made sure of that. Mission recorder Yemi Adeyemi was, I came to understand over those 17 days, the other half of a plan that had been built over months. Where Mara was the part of the plan that stood in the courtroom, Adeyemi was the part that stayed in the gallery. She had spent the entire evidentiary period not as a passive observer, but as a one-person documentation engine, cross-referencing every piece of counsel testimony against public record, flagging inconsistencies, building a case file that was not about the charges against Mara Okafor, but about the structure that had required those charges to exist. When the council dropped the charges, Adeyemi filed that case file with 7 independent press outlets, for academic institutions specializing in galactic law, and one very interested committee of the Cathari High Senate who had been, it emerged, quietly looking for exactly this kind of documentation for reasons of their own. The conversation continued for the next 2 years. I watched it continue. From my position in the Cathari consulate, then from a different position, the one the Cathari High Senate offered me after the Vale and I situation became the thing that reshaped every political relationship in this sector, and being the diplomat who'd been in that courtroom became suddenly, specifically valuable. It was not a promotion exactly. It was more like the galaxy suddenly needed someone who understood what had happened, and I was one of a small number of beings who'd been close enough to know. But this account is not about the 2 years of institutional consequence. It is about Mara Okafor and what I understood about her, and what she left behind in me that I have not been able to locate the correct Cathari word for. The Vale and I intervention began 63 days after the charges were dropped. It was the Council's intervention in the technical sense, their ships, their resources, their formal diplomatic structure. But it was built on Mara's biometric documentation, structured around her recommendations, and staffed at the Council's quietly furious concession by her crew. The Council's own xenobiologists would have taken 6 months to reach the same understanding of the Vale and I situation that Mara had already developed. They did not have 6 months. She went back. Of course she went back. The charges were dropped, the intervention was authorized, and Mara Okafor packed her research kit and her paper books and got on a ship headed for Vale and I convergent space before the Council's administrative division had finished processing her formal clearance. The Council administrator who called to inform her that her clearance was processing and she should wait for official confirmation received a response that I was told by Adeyemi, who was on the ship, laughing, was extremely polite, and entirely ignored the suggestion that she wait. She was already through the boundary by the time the clearance cleared. I did not go with her. My role was in the council chamber and the consulate in the long, slow diplomatic work of making sure what had happened to the Vale and I could not be structured into a quiet administrative category and filed away. That work was not interesting in the way that crossing quarantine boundaries is interesting. It was the work of sitting in rooms and asking questions and writing things down and asking the questions again when the answers were insufficient, which they frequently were. It turned out, reasonably good at it. And Mara sent transmissions. Not frequently. She was not a being who communicated constantly, which I had noticed in the detention corridor and confirmed across 18 days of visiting and 2 years of occasional contact. But she sent them when there was something to say, and what she had to say was always worth waiting for. The first transmission from Vale and I space came 41 days into the intervention. They remembered the request being filed. They didn't know what happened to it. They thought no one answered because no one cared. I told them it was more complicated than that. They asked me what complicated meant. I said, humans have a lot of words for that too. And the second, 68 days in, the biologic is a slow-acting contamination from a decommissioned council relay station inside the boundary. Automated system, failing for years, leaking coolant compound into the Vale and I atmospheric substrate. Nobody's fault in the way that old broken things aren't anybody's fault. Just nobody checked. We can fix it. 4-year remediation. Maybe 3 if the Vale and I metabolic adaptation goes the way the data suggests. They'll make it. A third, 112 days in. That was just, they have music. You wouldn't believe the music. I thought about that third transmission for a long time. I thought about what it meant that the first thing Mara Okafor transmitted after confirming the Vale and I would survive was not the technical data or the remediation projections, but the fact of their music. I thought about what it revealed about how she organized the world, what information she considered worth transmitting first, what she thought I would understand from it. They have music, a species that had been dying in silence for 6 years, asking into the void if anyone would come. And they had music. I thought about the HFY file on the Cathari Intelligence Database, the informal designation that the Cathari Intelligence Service used for classified assessments of human capability and behavioral profiling, a designation that translated roughly as humanity. Notable cases. I had access to this file by virtue of my position. I had never opened it before the Meridian Conclave. I opened it after. The designation originated approximately 40 years ago in Cathari records, following a series of first contact encounters that had produced according to the intelligence officers who filed the initial reports, behavioral data requiring separate categorical treatment. The phrase, notable cases, was diplomatic. What the reports actually described, I read several of them, sitting in my briefing room with the ventilation system carrying the sounds of station in motion, was species-level bewilderment. Humans did things that no survival optimization framework produced, things that made no sense in the language of cost and benefit. They ran into burning structures to pull out strangers. They took in wounded enemy combatants and nursed them to health. They wrote poetry about loss in the middle of wars. They named their equipment, formed emotional bonds with inanimate objects, kept pets that served no tactical function, made music in the dark, laughed at the things that should have broken them. The intelligence reports had various theories. Inefficiency artifact, cognitive misfire, cultural vestige from a less rational evolutionary period. None of the theories were right, because all of them were trying to fit human behavior into a framework of rational optimization, and human behavior does not fit there. Human behavior fits in a framework that the Kethari do not have a native word for, and the reason we don't have a word for it is that we did not evolve it. Mara Okafor stood in a courtroom and accepted a death sentence and used the 4 seconds between that sentence and the security team reaching her chip to throw a piece of data across a room. Not because she had a reasonable chance of surviving the next hour. She probably didn't think she had a reasonable chance of surviving the next hour. She did it because there was a species dying in silence in a quarantine system, and she had promised them someone would come looking. She did it because she had made a promise. That is what the intelligence file couldn't categorize. The Kethari notion of promise is conditional, a stated intention that remains operative while the conditions for its fulfillment remain viable. When the conditions become non-viable, the intention is suspended. This is rational. This makes sense. Humans make promises like they are building load-bearing walls. The more impossible the conditions become, the harder they push against them. The death sentence doesn't cancel the promise. It just becomes part of the wall's load. They were asking if anyone would come looking for them if they disappeared. Yes, that single word, delivered in the corridor of a detention center on Meridian Station, addressed to a Kethari diplomatic attaché sitting cross-legged on a floor that was not comfortable for his frame. That single word was the entire architecture of what followed. Everything Mara Okafor did from that moment was just the structural consequence of a word she'd already decided. I saw her once more in person 8 months after the Vale and I intervention began. She was on Meridian Station for a council briefing, the first of what would become, eventually, the Vale and I integration sessions, a series of formal meetings designed to bring the Vale and I convergence into active galactic community membership rather than quarantine non-status. She had been asked to present the intervention's progress data. She came to the briefing in the same functional gear she'd worn at the trial. I recognized the jacket, the wear patterns on the sleeves, carrying a satchel that had a paper book spine visible through the half-open flap. She looked less tired than she had in the detention corridor. She looked like someone who had slept and eaten at regular intervals and spent time doing work they found meaningful, which is a specific quality of physical ease that has no precise Kethari equivalent. After the briefing, which she delivered without unnecessary decoration and which contained, in its 4th slide, a quiet asterisk footnote citing the original unauthorized cross-boundary contact that had produced the initial biometric data, she found me in the corridor. "Attaché," she said. "Okafor." I fell in a step beside her. The briefing went well. The council spent 40 minutes on jurisdictional semantics. She pulled the satchel strap up on her shoulder. But they approved the remediation funding, which is what matters. Everything else is just, she made a small, dismissive hand gesture that I had come to understand was how she filed away things she found frustrating, but not worth spending energy on. We walked for a moment. "The Vale and I asked about you," she said. I stopped. She kept walking 2 steps before she stopped too, and looked back at me. "They've been told about the High Council proceedings," she said. "They know what happened. They want to know about the beings who were there." She paused. "I told them you stayed in the corridor. They want to know why." I thought about how to answer this. In Kethari social architecture, the honest answer would require acknowledging that I had not known why I stayed, which was a kind of uncertainty that the architecture doesn't handle gracefully. You're supposed to have reasons. Reasons are supposed to precede actions. "What did you tell them?" I asked. The corner of her mouth did that thing. I told them you were learning something, she said, and that you didn't want to stop until you'd learned it. She started walking again. I fell back into step. Was I? I asked. I don't know, she said. Are you still learning it? I thought about the transmissions. They have music. I thought about Thelvas and the human absence of it. I thought about a data chip thrown in an arc across a courtroom, and a woman who crossed a quarantine boundary not because the odds were good, but because she'd made a promise, and promises were load-bearing walls. I thought about the specific quality of the thing Mara Okafor had put in me that I had not managed to find the Cathari word for. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe that was the point. Yes, I said. We walked to the end of the corridor. Through a viewport, the Cathari home cluster was visible, distant, small, brilliant. The sort of sight you forget to notice when you've worked on stations long enough. Mara stopped and looked at it. Do they know, she said quietly, how big this is? What they're looking at? The council. They're beginning to, I said. Not the Vale and I situation, she said. That. All of that. She made a gesture toward the viewport, toward the cluster, toward, I understood, the galaxy behind it, the species in it, the 10,000 years of carefully managed galactic architecture built on the assumption that rationality meant the same thing to everyone. What's coming? What they haven't accounted for. What's coming? I asked. She looked at the star cluster for another moment. There are 47 convergent stage species in the Council's monitoring database, she said. The Vale and I were one of them. I've been through the data on the others. She turned away from the viewport. 7 of them have the wrong kind of silence. I stood in the corridor of Meridian Station 8 months after a trial that had restructured everything I understood about what power was for, and I looked at Mara Okafor. She looked like someone who had put something heavy down and reached for the next heavy thing. Not because she didn't feel the weight, because she had decided the weight was hers to carry. What are you going to do? I asked. She picked up the satchel strap again. I'm going to go find out, she said, if they're asking if anyone's coming. She walked toward the docking section. I watched her go, and I understood in that moment, in the corridor of Meridian Station with the Cathari home cluster brilliant behind me, and a human woman walking toward her ship, I understood what I had been learning in that detention corridor, and that courtroom, and 18 days of visits, and 2 years of transmissions, and this final moment. Humans do not wait to be given a role in the story. Every other species I have studied, in 41 proceedings and 30 years of diplomacy, waits. Waits for the structure to grant permission. Waits for the authority to assign the task. Waits for conditions to become viable, for odds to become reasonable, for someone above to indicate that proceeding is acceptable. Humans look at the story and decide what part they will play in it. And then they play it with everything they have, regardless of what the structure says about their eligibility. The Galactic High Council had given Mara Okafor a role, defend it. She had accepted the role and played an entirely different one. I went back to my briefing room. I sat at my desk. I opened, for the first time in 30 years of diplomatic service, a document that was not a report or a recommendation or a formal response, but something with no category in Cathari institutional culture, something that had to borrow its form from a human tradition. I started writing, not because the Senate had asked for it, not because there was a filing window for it or a committee awaiting it or a career reason to produce it, because something had happened in Chamber 7 of the Meridian Conclave that needed to be real in a way that official records do not make things real. And because Mara Okafor had taught me, without ever stating it, that real things that go unspoken eventually become the wrong kind of silence. She was already through the boundary by the time I finished the first page. Of course she was.